Hello, everyone. I was just typing a chat message when I had to get on task. So I was going to say in the chat, we're so glad you're all here. We're just about to get started. As we're warming up and you're joining us, please say hello in the chat panel. Make sure that you select to all panelists and attendees, not just all panelists. And then introduce yourself. Tell us how you got here, what your connection is to any of the organizations that are going to be sharing information with you today. We're so glad that you're here. Let's see. So I am Virginia Brown. I'm the Vice President of Advancement here at Aeon. And I have the enormous pleasure of hosting or facilitating this great panel we have for you today. We're going to have three folks on the line who are going to be answering your questions. And why don't I go ahead and see their wonderful faces. Jeff, Trom, and Margaret, can you take your videos off? There they all are. Welcome and hello. I'm going to get us through some introductory stuff to get us going, and then we'll jump into questions from everyone. But who we've got with us here today is first Trom Huang. She's the policy advocate at the Alliance. The Alliance is a coalition of community-based organizations focused on advancing racial equity in the way decisions about housing, transportation, land use, environmental justice, and economic development are made across the region. We've got Margaret Kaplan, the president at the Housing Justice Center. The Housing Justice Center is a nonprofit advocacy and legal organization whose mission is to preserve and expand affordable housing for low-income people. And finally, we have Jeffrey Westbrook, who I have the privilege of working with here at Aeon. He's the vice president of Resident Connections. At Aeon, our mission is that we create and sustain quality, affordable homes that strengthen lives and communities. So these three very expert people are here to answer your questions, which you can submit through the Q&A. I want to start before getting into that, though, by thanking some of our generous sponsors of this series. Our silver sponsor, US Bank, thank you very much. Our bronze sponsors, IMA, JLL, a lot of letters, Kimball & Co., and Sunrise Banks. Thanks very much to all of our sponsors who are making our chat with everyone today possible. We're incredibly grateful for their support, and they are helping make homes affordable in the Twin Cities and for all of us to be here. Okay, so this is going to work. I'm going to ask the panel a question just to get everyone warmed up and get us started. After that, I'll feed your questions to the panel through the Q&A. So please enter any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A, which is different than the chat. If you're having any technical issues, the chat is the place to put that. I have other Aeon colleagues who are monitoring that, but I have a real hard time monitoring all the things. So if you want a question to go through me to the panelists, please put that specifically in the Q&A. We do have some questions that were submitted ahead of time. And if you're one of the folks that submitted those, thank you very much. And just know that we already have your questions in and we'll get to them hopefully today. Finally, I have to say, this is, I think, our sixth chat from home, and we have not yet gotten through every question that our wonderful supporters have asked. So if we don't get to your question, please know that we'll follow up with you one-on-one after the fact. So make sure to put your name with any questions that you put in. If you want to do anonymous, that's fine. But if we don't have time to get your question, we won't be able to follow up with you. Okay, I think that's it. We're so glad that you're here. All right, which gets us to our very first question. The question I'm going to ask is to each panelist. So maybe, Trom, if you're okay with it, I'd love for you to go first. I want to know, what is one thing that you want the audience to know about the relationship between race and housing, and how does your work address that issue?
Thanks, Virginia. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Again, my name is Trom Huang. I'm with the Alliance. And this question is really important to me because it's kind of the root of all the work that I do. I try to bring a race and power analysis to all of the housing issues, transportation issues, economic development issues that we work on at the Alliance. And so I think what I would most want people to understand is that today, as we see all of these racial inequities and racial disparities in housing, we have to kind of understand them in the arc of history. And that arc of history is that the harm that has been done to communities of color over the past few decades, but one could argue, I think like Jeffrey said really well a few days ago, over the past 400 years, has been very intentional, right? The harm has been very intentional in naming specifically what groups of people by race or by income don't get to access certain investments, benefits, subsidies in our housing system. That can be seen in the racially restrictive covenants, right, and excluding communities of color, especially Black households from home ownership. It can be seen in the redlining and disinvestment of communities of color. Um, and because all of those harms were so specific and multiple, right? We don't just have one big policy that excludes people of color from housing. We have like a death by 100 paper cuts. And so our solutions to those problems have to be, first of all, there have to be many solutions. It's not just one. And there also have to be solutions that are really specific and intentional in targeting benefits to the communities of color that were intentionally harmed by historic and current policies. And how that relates to my work at the Alliance today, we're part of a coalition called HENS, Housing Equity Now St. Paul. And our goal right now is to pass a housing policy in St. Paul that does just that, right? That does target benefits to communities of color who are most impacted by the many layers of racial inequities in our housing system. And what we're doing is fighting for a rent stabilization policy that would limit the rate at which rents can increase, because we know that there are many solutions to the housing crisis. And one of them has to be keeping St. Paul home, keeping people who currently live in housing that is accessible to them, whether that's, a homeowner or a renter. A renter is paying $2,000 a month versus a renter who's paying $800 a month. We need all of our renters to have safe and stable housing. And our policy won't impact the majority of people because the majority of people aren't seeing egregious and outrageous rent increases. But Cura data, the data from the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, has shown that renters of color and low wealth renters are more likely to experience outrageous and egregious rent increases. And when I say that, I mean the $100, $200 a month increase that economically evict people. And so our coalition is fighting for that policy because it's very intentional and specific. It's not going to impact the majority of people because the majority of people don't experience those rent hikes, but the people who experience them most are people of color, renters of color in the Twin Cities region. And so we're fighting for this policy in hopes of kind of advancing this new way of policymaking that doesn't just assume everyone will benefit and let the same people fall through the cracks. We're really being specific about naming who should benefit from a policy.
That's great, Trom. Thank you so much. Margaret, how would you feel about going next? So same question to you. Tell us a little bit about your feeling on this work and how your specific work at the Housing Justice Center relates.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I would start by saying that housing justice and racial justice issues are essentially the same issue. When you look at housing opportunities, at housing outcomes, at household wealth, and the disparities that exist in our system today, it is impossible to divide the racial inequities from inequities that exist in our housing system. And the second thing I would say is that a lot of the times, as we think about looking at inequities in the housing system and housing as a racial justice issue, we're really looking at it through this legal lens of anti-discrimination laws and fair housing. But there are limits to how far that goes. And that just because something doesn't fall under a very concrete definition of housing discrimination does not mean it's just or fair or right or providing people access to opportunities. And then finally, one of the things that I think is important as we think about it, and then this is sort of related to Trom's point about our current disparities in the housing system being related to deliberate choices, is that today, even if there are not deliberate choices that are being made by individuals to discriminate against people in the housing system, we have facially neutral policies that seem like everybody is going to end up in the same place that result in discriminatory outcomes. It's that disparate impact analysis that you may have heard about. And the reason that that is important is because right now, today, you could have a system that looks equal. And because everybody is starting from where they are based on this history, people end up in very, very different places. And until we address those disparities that happen, not just in individual intentions, but in systems that lead to outcomes, we cannot get to the heart of the racial inequities in our housing system. And the way it relates to our work is we do both policy and legal advocacy work. So we both bring fair housing, anti-discrimination cases, or cases that are about other issues in the housing system that are operating in very disparate ways. And we also work with our partners, because we don't do anything alone. We work with our partners to try and understand what are those changes to the legal rights that people have that are going to kind of like shoot the roof in terms of people having equitable access to safe, stable, dignified, and affordable housing.
Thank you for that, Margaret. I just love really grounding this conversation in the idea of no matter what policies or structures we come up with right now, people aren't starting from the same place. So you can't assume the same policy is going to affect everybody the same way, but really appreciate that. Jeff, last but certainly not least, your answer to this question.
Thank you, Virginia, and welcome to my two panelists along with me today. My name is Jeff Westbrook. I'm the VP of Resident Services here at Aeon. And my answer to the question, the thing that I would want everyone to know is that as both Trom and Margaret have shared, this is a practice that has gone on for 100 of years, and it has been deliberate and intentional. And maybe one thing that I would share specifically in Minnesota, while we have a high quality of life in our general population in the state, we also have the largest disparities in the country in terms of especially Black home ownership and many of the things that have been talked about with my two peers here on the panel. And so it has been very deliberate and intentional, and it will require that type of action and activity to reverse the things that have been put in place by both our federal government, our state government, and our local government. So to have an individual and the individuals that I deal with on a daily basis try to contend with policies that have been put in place at every political level is quite daunting. And unless we take action as a community, as a state, as a group, our individuals can't overcome some of these challenges and barriers that have been put in place. And we've seen it reflected again in this past COVID year, that these many disparities have had impact that was not even foreseen by the general population. A lot of the outcomes that we've seen couldn't have been predicted by individuals because of the position and place that they start from. So I would want us all to recognize that these aren't individual actions of individuals, but these are the actions of government at every level that creates some of the disparities and the challenges and problems that we see. My role here at Aeon is to work with our current residents and help support them in two specific ways. One, to deal with the instability that comes in living at the affordable housing level, the challenges and barriers that come to our residents, and see if we can't help support them, connect with county services, state services to get them over the hurdles that might otherwise destabilize their housing. And secondly, to build community within our properties and strengthen the lives, as was mentioned in our mission, strengthening the lives of residents and the community to propel them to a different level, to provide the support that's necessary to try to overcome some of these barriers that we are talking about today. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, and why don't you stay unmuted? I'll start with you. So everyone who's listening in, this is your moment to submit questions. I'm already looking at several really good ones, which is great. And some of them are very policy focused. So I know that all the panelists and I are going to do our best to make sure that those who are a little less familiar with some of the policy terms and acronyms going on that we'll do our best. But if we glide right past something that doesn't make sense, feel free to also pose that question to make sure that everyone's keeping up, because we all live and breathe housing and racial justice and housing all the time. And so sometimes we forget that folks aren't as clued into some of the language as we are. But Jeff, I am going to start with you. This first question is actually one about a particular community. What would you say is your focus on racial equity and ensuring older adults have a place to call home? What support might we need from external partners to advance that work?
I think one of the challenges that we see in our senior properties, and especially again, pointing to our COVID year, of dealing with isolation, dealing with isolation and depression that comes with living alone, not having support structures around them that we assume many of our residents would have. And also, I think importantly as well, is the fact that we want to keep our seniors housed as long as possible. And so one of the barriers that we face is how do we provide the supports that are needed to keep our residents living in their independent living homes as long as possible. And so those are some of the challenges we see with our senior population. In many cases, if we can find services that will provide just minor kinds of adjustments and supports to our residents, we find that they can extend their independent living for a year or two just by needing or filling the need of minor support functions that we try to bridge the gap for.
Thanks for that. All right, our next question comes from Doug. Thanks for the question, Doug. Maybe Margaret, I'll pass this one to you. And there might be some where I think Trom and Margaret probably equally have comments. So, and Jeff, you too, everybody chime in if I'm assigning the question to the wrong person. But Margaret, can you speak to Minneapolis's development of a tenant opportunity to purchase policy, also known as a TOPA policy?
Sure. Yeah, we've been very involved in conversations about that, as have the folks at the Alliance. And tenant opportunity to purchase is a kind of policy that's really exciting because what it does is it changes the dynamic of who gets to decide the future of your own home and your own housing. What a policy of tenant opportunity to purchase does is it says that if somebody is going to sell rental housing, they have to offer the people who are living there, who have been paying the rent and therefore making the payments on the mortgage and the upkeep, they have to have the first opportunity to be able to either buy it cooperatively or work with a partner as a nonprofit to purchase the property to keep it affordable for people to call home and to retain that community. The thing that's great about tenant opportunity to purchase in many ways is that it changes the dynamic of who owns and controls land and property in the city of Minneapolis. If you think about what our other panelists said about the history of decisions made on the local level that kept people out, the decisions by banks that kept some folks, particularly Black households, from buying homes and properties. The only way you fix that is by deliberately changing the dynamic about who has those opportunities. And it's not a bad deal for the current building owners as well, too, because nothing in tenant opportunity to purchase requires that existing building owners are selling it to new potential owners for any less than they would get from anyone else. It does need a little bit more time for that dynamic to play out, but this has been very successful in communities around the country, most notably in Washington, D.C. It's also not unique. This isn't a new idea in Minnesota. There is actually a right of first refusal for people who live in manufactured home communities. So in some ways, this is the kind of policy that we've had in place in Minnesota in a slightly different form for a while and has been upheld by the court system as well. So it's pretty exciting development.
It is exciting. And I also love your enthusiasm and passion about it. Thanks, Margaret. Trom, this one's going to come over to you. This question is from Julie. Thanks, Julie, for submitting a question and being here today. Julie's saying she's the chair of a local planning commission. What advice can you give a planning commission relative to improving housing, social and racial equity, planning principles, zoning, etc.? What do you think, Trom?
Thanks. Yeah, this is a great question. And I actually formerly served on the St. Paul Planning Commission. So this is a really good chance for me to talk a little bit about that. I think the most important thing for folks to realize about our planning system is that it is rooted in a system of white supremacy, right? And so anything that is race neutral on its face, like Margaret said, always has disparate impacts on different people based on where they are economically, wealth-wise, and all of that. So I think the really important thing to realize about Planning Commission is that you hold a lot of power, and you should always approach that with the lens of, what context were these zoning codes, were these laws made in, and how has that context changed? How can we start to improve our zoning code to take into account the racial inequities that we see today? And also, I think a second thing I really want to point to is that within Planning Commission, it can often feel like a predominantly white space. I think representation is getting a lot better because of programs that are training up people of color to be leaders. I'm thinking of a really good one that Nexus runs called, BCLI. I can't remember what it stands for, but Nexus's program is great. And there are many programs out there that are training people to bring their community power and people power with them to spaces of commissions and advisory boards. And so I think if you're on a nominating committee and you see an emerging leader in one of those spaces applying for a spot on Planning Commission, please be a part of supporting their leadership to be in those spaces. That's probably how I got on Planning Commission, right? Someone who thought, she doesn't have direct zoning experience. I did study urban planning in grad school, but I didn't have direct zoning experience. And I appreciate whoever on the Planning Commission nominating committee who said, but she has this experience of community development, but she has this experience of XYZ, and she can bring that to enrich the perspectives that we have on Planning Commission. And I also think that one last thing I'll add is that the systems that we have historically used to make planning decisions in a predominantly white space, those same systems will be used by organizers, policy advocates, communities of color to make decisions that might not be the same decisions we've historically seen, right? And I think that we have to respect that process. When a comp plan is being used as a decision-making tool, when zoning code is being used as a decision-making tool, all of those things can be interpreted differently. And I think the important thing is to not let the white supremacy in our planning system hold a white interpretation of a comp plan or zoning code over an interpretation that might be different from communities of color. So I think that's a really important thing to notice. Decisions have been made historically that maybe lean a certain way, and we have to realize that increased representation by communities of color in decision-making spaces like this might lead to different decisions, and we have to respect those processes.
I love that, Trom, and I had forgotten that you served on the commission, so I love that just karmically happened. I wonder if you could also say a little bit, if anybody listening is curious about how they would inquire about being on a commission or something like that. Do you have any advice about that?
Yeah, I think, well, when I lived in St. Paul and I live in Minneapolis now, I think council members are pretty good at putting things in their newsletters, kind of like a call for recruitment. And then I think every city website has a page where they're always listing openings on various boards and commissions. And I can try to find them and put them in the chat.
Another thing that I would recommend too for anybody who's interested is don't forget about the boards, commissions that exist on the county level and on the state level as well too. And counties and states are really good at getting that information out there, and they're constantly taking applications. And some of those boards have some real power to them that it's important that we have people be a part of.
Thanks, Margaret. That's great. I'm going to put out there, Kathy, you've asked a question. I'm not sure I totally understand the question. I'm wondering if you could clarify a bit, because I'd love to get to yours, but I'm not 100% that I'm following. And in the meantime, Margaret, let me go to you. We've got a question of, what can I do as a white resident of the Twin Cities to support racial equity in housing? Wondering what your thoughts are on that.
It's a really good
Big.
question. Yes, it is. It is a huge question. You know, I think a big part of it is trying to identify the places and spaces where you can connect with and listen to grassroots community-based organizations, so that everything from, because I think that's a really good way to kind of get rid of some pre-existing assumptions. One of the things that, and I think this is true like in government, but it's true with individuals as well too. It's so easy to use your own point of view to make assumptions about what is the issue we're trying to address, what is the problem we're trying to solve, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve. And so often what happens, particularly for communities of color, for low wealth communities, for people with disabilities, is that decisions happen at people rather than with them. So I think one big part of it is being part of the listening, and understanding and knowing that maybe what your preconceived notion of what the issue is and what the best outcome is isn't going to be the one that's going to be the most important to the people who are most directly affected. The second thing that I would say is really important is showing up to support community articulated objectives and needs. It's and in the development space, one of the things I keep thinking about is how easy it is to get a bajillion people to show up to oppose an affordable housing development in a community that doesn't have any affordable housing. We see this all the time. We see activity of creating like Facebook fundraisers in order to sue a city for daring to create housing that's affordable for people in the community, in the workforce, the people we need to do essential jobs, right? There is less activity and motion in showing up to say, yes, we need people who need affordable housing. And that our definition of affordable housing isn't about some abstract AMI thing. It's about individuals who are working jobs in our community. It's about individuals who are living in our community. And sometimes that means that the housing that we need to get behind has to be, for example, at 30% below AMI. Or even less than that. I mean, I think about this, for example, personal care aides in Minnesota make an average of right around $12 an hour. If you worked full-time year round at $12 an hour and you have a family, you're making less than 30% below AMI. This is not unusual. This is 28% of the households in Minneapolis, 25% of the households in St. Paul. So we need to show up, and we need to show up to support the things that are going to be asked for by and supported by communities most affected.
Thanks for that, Margaret. And can I ask for one clarification? Can you say a little bit more about what AMI means?
Absolutely. So area median income is just that. So it's like the median amount that people make for the Twin Cities in the Twin Cities 7-county metro area. And one of the things that skews stuff a lot is that we are a prosperous region, but it is not a shared prosperity. So for example, when you look at the median income for Black households in Hennepin County, that is below 50% of the area median income for overall households in the Twin Cities region. So it's a way that we sort of measure affordability, but it smooths out the edges and makes it less about what individuals need and more about this sort of like abstract magical person. And very rarely do people fit in that box comfortably.
Thanks for that.
One,
Oh, go
one
ahead.
thing
Yeah.
one thing I'd like to share is while we look most often at the disparities and people of color, I think one way to flip this is to look at the artificial communities that are created by some of these policies of not in my backyard and other things. The reality is we create environments that are not natural. An all white suburb with the exact same um, economic and wealth level is absolutely an artificial creation of our doing. And I think along with the fact that we have disparities, it creates an artificial environment that children that grow up in that environment aren't equipped to operate in the real world, the world that includes tremendous diversity. And so the reality is those stark environments are not natural, and they're as detrimental to majority communities as is some of the disparities that we see in communities of color. And maybe if we flip that flashlight a little bit and show the awkward and unrealistic environments that exist by some of these policies and creation, I think we would see that the diversity that we're trying to create is more natural and more in the realm of what living on a global planet of humanity is more reflective of.
I'd love
Jeff,
to I'd love to add to what Jeff said because this resonates with me a lot. I grew up in a really racially and economically diverse neighborhood, and I feel like that is pretty rare to find these days. I think one thing to answer the question that was asked, what can white allies do? I think a really important thing is to push back on this idea that we have to deconcentrate poverty, right? Because when we talk about poverty, people who are more likely to experience poverty because of systemic racism are people of color. And when we say deconcentrate poverty, what we're actually saying is moving people of color around. When I think what we really want to do is invest in communities that are not at the same economic level and uplift them so they can, so they can no longer be a place of a lot of poverty. I think, we celebrate like Little Saigon and Little Italy. We have all of these communities where people of color choose to live in community, and we celebrate that. But then I don't understand why this narrative of deconcentrating poverty tends to often target Black communities, right? Black neighborhoods that are thriving in their own way, that are surviving by supporting small businesses that have created their own community assets and are constantly being told, oh, we don't want you to live here anymore. We need to move you around. That's such an inequitable and frankly racist policy. So I think being a white ally means recognizing the community that you live in, reflecting on, what are the things you love about living in your community, and why can't we have that for other communities, as opposed to looking at communities that don't have the same resources and saying, well, that's just a bad place for people to live, they gotta leave. Like, we need to invest in the places that need more resources so that people can stay in their communities if they choose to, and have a better quality of life.
Love that, Trom. Thanks for jumping in. And actually, this segues really well into the next question, Jeff, that I'm going to direct at you. It's from Donna, who asked, what can I do as a realtor to combat the systemic racism in housing?
I think some of the very real situations that are created is false choice. And so in many ways, we've already predetermined who will live where, and we direct our efforts toward that, and we perpetuate some of the things that exist currently. Minneapolis is an interesting city. This is my home city, so I know the city pretty well, and I always share that Minneapolis is one of those cities that you've got to drive around. there's nothing that defines the communities that exist in Minneapolis. You go down a side street and you come across a creek or a river or some amenity that you would never know based on community definitions, that those kinds of highlights exist within the city. And so I think from that standpoint of really demonstrating that Minneapolis has a wealth of opportunity for anyone who, if given the opportunity, will find and make their home across the city. And I see when there's freedom to move, or as situations open up, you find very diverse and vibrant communities in pockets all around the city. I think that's what we would hope for our entire community, our 7-county metro area. And one of the realities of the state is wherever you go in the state, even in the furthest reaches of the state, you will find communities of color. They already exist, they're already there, and they're already in many cases thriving in those communities where they've been allowed to settle and put their roots down and build community where they are. So this is not a situation where I think it's impossible to find people to have access to communities around the state. It's not fighting against those opportunities. And I would say, again, in those artificial environments where you don't see communities of color, it's because there's been an active level of suppression as opposed to any kind of normal progression that might take place. And where it's open, we find that there are communities that are thriving in outstate Minnesota as they are in urban areas of the state.
Trom, did I see you want to jump in with something there?
Yeah, I wanted to speak from my personal experience. I actually very recently purchased a home, which is why there's boxes everywhere in my background. And I think one thing that really helped from my realtor was not feeling the pressure to enter these bidding wars. Because if we think about the wealth disparities across communities of color, these bidding wars that I know are happening, but honestly, I didn't feel the pressure to participate in, and a few of my friends who are also people of color have purchased recently and also haven't felt that pressure. That pressure to enter a bidding war really advantages folks with more intergenerational wealth, right? The pressure to waive an inspection and then end up with like a $10,000 sewage problem is something that favors intergenerational wealth. If I had waived an inspection and then, been stuck with $15,000 worth of repairs, I would not have any safety net. I wouldn't have parents to go to and say, hey, can you pull a home equity loan from your house to help me pay for this? I think when we get really competitive and when realtors encourage folks to, really fight hard and throw as much money as they can into home ownership, that really puts communities of color at a disadvantage and buyers of color at a disadvantage, because frankly, we don't have the intergenerational wealth and resources and safety net to compete and be able to bounce back if something goes wrong. So I think that's one piece from my personal experience as a home buyer that it made me appreciate my realtor.
Thanks so much for that, both of you. Let me move over to Margaret. Kathy, thank you for clarifying your question. I appreciate you doing that. Apologies that I had to ask the question. I think what Kathy's trying to drive at is, it seems that there were some adjustments made to policy some time ago around how people living with disabilities would operate within affordable housing, and that some of that did and didn't work. And I think the question is, what have we learned from some of that about what did and didn't work? And how can we use that learning to make sure we don't make similar mistakes when it comes to racial justice focused policies around housing?
Yeah. So I think what she's referring to is the Olmstead consent decree and some similar actions that were taken to say that, at one point in time, the approach for housing for people with disabilities was really to have it sort of all together. And one of the challenges with that is people ended up in more restrictive environments than they needed to be, considering what their disability was, and weren't given the opportunity to have self-determination in their housing choices. And I think what people learned through that, and there are definitely people who are way more sort of fluent on this issue than I am, for sure. But I think what we learned from that process that happened over a really long period of time, is that there wasn't just one kind of housing's good and one kind of housing's bad, and everybody needs this and nobody needs that. I think it really came down to, it was the most successful when individuals and their families had options and choices and were given the information and tools and resources to make those choices. And that's where people ended up the happiest with their housing and the most successful in their housing. And in some ways, I think one of the things that this relates to in the fair housing space is that question about choice and self-determination, right? Fundamentally, fair housing isn't about people telling somebody where they have to live. It's about people having options. Those fair housing options they have to exist. So if you need an affordable place to live, that needs to be available. It needs to be available free from discriminatory barriers, whether those are sort of that direct interpersonal discrimination. And we do see some of that in systems like credit screening. I mean, we've all heard horror stories about bad landlords, right? But like a lot of it isn't that interpersonal, it's sort of the systemic. What are the systems and structures that lead to people making the choices that they make about people's access to housing opportunities? And then the third is people have to be provided with information about those choices. What choices are available? What are the consequences of those choices? What does it mean to make a choice? So in order for people to really have access to fair and just housing, and I think this is somewhat similar to the Olmsted conversation, but also quite a bit different too, is people need options, free from discriminatory barriers, and they need the information in order to know those options exist and to be able to make choices.
Love super easy work to do, I know. Trom, let me go back to you. What would you say would be, and this is a question from Elizabeth, what would you say would be the most significant potential public policy program that promotes racial justice in housing? Like, what can people get behind today that they should put their support to address this issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one that we get asked by policymakers a lot because it's really easy to have one silver bullet, right? And I think the difficult thing about housing is that there are so many flaws in the housing system that we have to tackle them one by one. And I think there are a few policies that would really help. I mean, overall, there's just a need for increased federal investment in deeply affordable housing, right? So that's one thing that you can stand behind at the federal level. I think at the state, there's a lot of discussion about bonding for more housing dollars. I think I'm not as in touch with state level work. I'm mostly regional, and so maybe Margaret can speak more to that. I think what's really timely right now is looking at the eviction moratorium and making sure that when the off-ramp to the eviction moratorium starts, we don't have a wave of evictions in our state. We know that people are behind on rent. We know that people are trying to pay the rent. We know because the Alliance is a coalition of member organizations, and many of these member organizations are helping people directly to apply for rental assistance. And it's a slow bureaucratic process, right? It takes months at a time. And people want to pay their back rent. They want to have a place to live. They don't want to be in a situation in 3 months where, you know, they've been lost in the paperwork and are trying to get the rental assistance and end up on the street. And I'm really worried, frankly, that that's what's going to happen. So I think one thing that's really important is talking to your legislators about ensuring that we do not have a wave of evictions. in Minnesota. And then, oh yeah, I see Margaret. Maybe you can chime in.
Please, Margaret, jump in.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I don't mean to cut you off, Trump. I'm sure you have more ideas. And we are one of the field partners on the rent help, and it is a real challenge. And we're mostly working with people who do not have internet access and are pretty isolated and don't have a lot of access to technology. So the process for them is going to be longer. A couple specific policies, and some of these are super pie in the sky and some of them are way too modest in terms of addressing disparities in the housing system. One, and this is being talked about on the federal level, and that is universal availability of rental assistance, of vouchers. Because one of the biggest issues in the housing system is there are so many people, because of our inequitable economy, who cannot afford places to call home. And vouchers are a way that we can get there. But second, that's critically important to make that work, is source of income protections that apply to those voucher programs, so that if I need a place to call home and I get my golden ticket after waiting on a wait list for 2 years, I can actually use it, because there are so many places that just say, no, we can't be bothered. And the third, which is maybe the most pie in the sky, but I think is absolutely essential to addressing the disparities in home ownership and in access to capital, is getting rid of our current credit scoring system, because it has so much discrimination baked into it. And that is what decides whether people can buy a home or not, if you can get a job or not, if you can get car insurance or not, if you can rent an apartment or not. It has so many fundamental flaws to the way that it works that are having a vast disproportionate impact on households of color. And we know that, and we need to fix it.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Let me jump in and say, just as we said at the beginning, these systems have been in place for decades and longer. I think we have to be as intentional and deliberate in our policies and practices to reverse the damage that's already been done. So, in terms of, is there one magic bullet? No, but if we understand that the damage has been created by our federal, state, and local systems, it takes that same deliberate action to begin to reverse these practices and policies that in many endanger endanger our communities and families of color. COVID demonstrated that perfectly, that it's not only those communities that are impacted, ultimately it impacts our entire community. And so unhoused people who are not able to do something as basic as store their medication. And it's something very simple, but if you don't have a home, you don't have a refrigerator, then your ability to keep up with your medicine is impacted, which impacts health. We have to be extremely intentional about redirecting resources and doing what it takes to help people get stabilized. And that benefits the entire community, not just those that we immediately impact with some of these decisions. It has to be intentional. It has to be deliberate for us to move this forward.
Tom, are you about to jump in, or shall I move on? You had a movement.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what Jeffrey said and what Margaret's been saying too, which is that policies don't have to come from a place of racism in order to have disparate impacts on different people. And so what I really push everyone to do is not place blame, right? Because blame is on our systems. What we really need to focus on is, how are these systems impacting people, and how specifically can our solutions focus on making sure that the policies that are passed don't impact people as disparately as they currently are. I think, yeah, a lot of times people will see policies and say, well, that's not racist. And it's not, but it has a different impact on people of color based on the systemic racism in our system that has built upon, layers and layers of institutions and decades of policy making. So something doesn't have to be racist to have racial impacts. And I think that's what I really want to push when we think about solutions.
Thanks for that. And this is such great information we're enjoying from each of you, and we're getting close on time. So a couple more questions, but I want to pose this to everyone. And if you think you have an answer, let me know. But a question came in, who's doing this well? Is there any model, any city, county, state, country that does it better than what we see here locally that we could point to and learn from, who is addressing some of these racial inequities in housing? And I pose it to all of you because I don't know the answer, but I'm hoping somebody does, but I don't know who might.
My answer, I would maybe flip this a little bit. One of the things about living in Minnesota on the national level, we score high in terms of quality of life across many metrics. I think a personal embarrassment for me is that in those metrics, it doesn't include everyone. And so in a high quality of life in America, in the United States, it should raise the tide for everyone that's part of that community. And so for me, when we see that there's an imbalance, that is just enough of what I need to know that if the tide is not rising for everyone, if it's not rising for everyone, it's an embarrassment for us to claim to have that high quality of life and excludes any community. So that's my measure. If we have a high education system, it should be high for everyone that's a part of the state. If we have a high quality of life, Minnesota always ranks high in terms of parks and access to parks and all of those kinds of things. That should be for every one of our communities. And anyone that is excluded from those quality of life measures means that we haven't quite reached that lofty goal that we are attempting to attain. So if we are a high quality state, let it be a high quality state for every resident in the state. And where that's not the case, that's the work that we have to do.
Trom, Margaret, any thoughts on that?
I guess I'm thinking of the West Side Community Organization. When folks say like who's doing it well, I don't think there's a city or state that's kind of stands out because everyone's dealing with such similar issues. But when I think of local power, I think of the West Side Community Organization in St. Paul. Not only do they have a great staff, a kick-ass executive director in Monica Bravo, but they are really listening to community members in the work that they do. They have a lot of powerful organizing, and I think that reflects a lot of progress in the way that decisions are being made about the neighborhood. I know that they've had like an equitable development scorecard that they've been able to collaborate with developers on to bring in the types of development, whether commercial or residential, that people want. And they're really listening to all of their neighbors about, what kind of neighborhood do you want to see in 10, 20 years? And how can we actually flex our muscles of people power to make that happen? What are our, pathways of power? Where do we really have the ability to influence these decisions? And let's organize our people into those channels of power so that they can participate in decision-making processes that are, dominated by the usual voices. So I think of Wesco as an example of an organization that does things right.
One thing I'd add to is these are such big things, and everyone is sort of in a different place, um, and that is like, well, I can't point to like one place where they're doing everything well. A lot of the times communities have to start where they are, right? It's not about like tomorrow we're going to address every problem starting from zero, but like, what can you do today? What can your community do today that makes it better than tomorrow, than the next day, than the next day, than the next day? And there are even some really good small examples in the Twin Cities metro area. I think a really good example of that is when the city of St. Louis Park got rid of the crime-free ordinance after a lot of pushing. I mean, it was a terrible policy that was having these dreadful, disparate impacts on households of color who were losing their home for really no reason at all. And there was a lot of community organizing that happened. People got together, including, JCA and Homeline and individuals in apartment buildings, and they created a real conversation in the community that got rid of a destructive policy. Did it take too long? Yes, it did. Did they achieve something that is terribly important? Yes. And you know what? There are so many cities around the state that could do exactly the same thing today and get rid of those kind of harmful policies, and that would make a difference. So I think part of it is like, let's look big picture, but also let's look at the small stuff that communities can be engaging in right now to make their community more equitable.
Love it. Well, we are almost out of time. So unfortunately, I am going to wrap us up and not be able to finish out the questions. As I guessed, we had a lot of great questions. I unfortunately wasn't able to ask our panelists. Like I said, if we have your name, we will follow up with you. If you have other questions, let us know. The team at Aeon will make sure to connect with not just Jeff, but also Margaret and Trom to get some feedback direct to everyone. I know that everyone is incredibly grateful for this conversation and wealth of information, so thank you. But this is the end of our time together. Your support of Aeon and of all of our organizations is critical for our community. These are big issues that we're trying to tackle. And the reality is it might be hard and we might take small steps, just like Margaret said, but we can really do some good. So look at what your local ordinances are, see how you can get involved in planning commissions, lift up other people of color who are trying to have a voice in your community. Those are some of the things I heard from these three about how we could move forward. You can also mark your calendar for our next Chats from Home event. We're going to have the next one on Thursday, September 23rd, also over the noon hour. This session is going to focus on housing development and will feature Alan Arthur, Aeon's president and CEO, and Sarah Harris, our executive vice president of strategy, partnerships, and productions. So they'll be talking about how we build and buy housing in the Twin Cities and Minnesota community. And of course, all three of our organizations need your support. I hope you'll consider supporting the work of Aeon, the Housing Justice Center, and the Alliance. You can make a gift online. I think one of my colleagues is going to post links in the chat, and we'll also include links in our follow-up email to everyone. But that's all we have for you today. I want to thank everyone. Jeff, Margaret, Trom, thank you so much for being a part of this. I really feel like I got a lot out of it. I hope that our listeners did as well. And that's going to do it for us. Have a great afternoon, everybody.